think I've been talking so much to all of you, I'm running out of sound. I'll do my best.
Do you want to take it off?
Please. Okay, that's better. So, Caroline has picked out some of the gems from the collection that's been generated. Not hearing? They're not hearing at the back.
I think you just have, it is turned on, but I think you just have to talk a little
Okay,
closer.
can you hear that? Is that
Yes.
right? Okay. So some gems that have been pulled from the collection that exists here and is, I gather, growing all the time. So I don't know, Caroline, I'm going to leave it to you. What do you want to start?
Well, let's talk about this Worth
Worth
dress.
dress. Okay.
Yes.
Now, Worth was a French costume designer. Actually, he was English, but he took his business to Paris. And during the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, Charles Worth's word on fashion was it. And anybody with money, and particularly the kind of ladies who summered here at the turn of the century, would be dressed by Worth. They made special trips to Paris to be fitted and get the latest styles. And this dress we see here, which has been altered, it's not in its original condition, but that often happens with dresses, is just an example to show you that fashion from somewhere as exotic and expensive and avant-garde as Paris made its way and was seen in Bar Harbor, something to appreciate. And later, as you'll see, there were also numerous dressmakers in this area who could make things that almost looked as good. But of course, the thing about Worth, like all the couturiers and fashion designers today, is that they generate ideas. And of course, the ideas only take on because people like them. It's not that they dictate the ideas. The ideas are floating around, but they only take off because people suddenly will like them. If they reject them, they don't become a fashion. So there's a lot of rejected fashions out there, but you only really hear about the ones that catch on, and today, of course, become part of the ready-to-wear business that we're all familiar with. So what would you like to move on to, Caroline?
Well, speaking of that, how about this
yes,
wedding
yes,
dress,
yes.
which is a Portland designer?
Yes,
is that
it
right?
is.
And Maisie,
Anna
I'm
Skinner.
sorry, I want to introduce Maisie Smollett, who's been working in the collections all year and will continue this year.
This is the bodice of a wedding dress. Now, around 1900, well-to-do girls had the most fantastic wedding dresses. Unbelievable. And I hope one day you will see this entire dress mounted here in the museum. This is the blouse bodice, and this is a very fine silk, and this is a machine-made lace, and this beautiful lace here, and it was made by a dressmaker from Portland, Maine, and it has a superb skirt, very elaborate, and often these skirts I often think should be displayed inside out, because the stitching is phenomenal. It's unbelievable that all that stitching was done just to be unseen, you know, like the roses blooming in the desert, so to speak. So, as I say, we'll put this back, and one day it's something to look forward to, seeing this beautiful, extremely fashionable wedding dress on display on a mannequin here. Another contrasting dress. Do you want to just look at that? This is a bodice of an evening dress covered with sequins from the same period. And it doesn't mean it's mourning because it's black. Black was a fashionable evening dress by 1900 and earlier. But I think just to see something like this encrusted with satin, silk satin of course, encrusted with probably hand-stitched sequins, and the whole skirt that would have been sewn. One can't imagine actually wearing clothes like that, sitting down in them, walking about in them. But you have these examples here to enjoy and think about the lifestyle that went with them and what it took to A, purchase them, and B, to maintain them. There. So,
Jackie, do you want to do this one next?
oh yes. This is a man's outfit to change tone for little. And the striped trousers, the frock cutaway coat in black, and the vest and the tie. This really came into style for men around the 1890s, but it remained so even up to the 1920s. People like businessmen, bank managers, anyone, store managers, anyone in that kind of position, any man in that kind of position wore this sort of uniform of the striped trousers and the jacket and the shirt. And shirts, with white shirt, usually a stiff collar. They got a little softer as time went by. So again, and these originally they would have been for, again, wealthy men. They would be tailor made and of the best cloth. But then going down the line, you eventually, I think certainly by 1900, there was a ready-to-wear industry. And an ordinary man could purchase a suit. Obviously, the fabric wouldn't be as good, or the cut and the fit, but he would look the same. And in fact, in the 1890s, everyone looked the same because of American ready-to-wear. And in fact, there's a story that a Russian potentate or aristocrat was visiting America and looked around and said, "Where are all the poor people?" For the simple reason that dress made everybody look well off. And in fact, being so well dressed disguised the fact that there was a lot of poverty because everyone looked well dressed. And that's the phenomenon of the American ready-to-wear industry that began really just after the Civil War, and it gathered speed and was really an amazing industry and has gone on from there. And by the 1890s was certainly clothing everybody. Okay. So let me just say one little thing first of all. If the gentlemen wore pinstripe suits and the dark coats, the minions and the servants wore something a little different. This was worn by a chauffeur. It's a waistcoat. So they wore little things always that immediately hinted that they were perhaps of a class a little further down the social scale. So there were those differences. Again, now this is something I hope you will see on the mannequin one day before too long. This is a woman's suit from the World War I period, in 1914, 15, thereabouts. And this beautiful wool fabric, and it's got this braid trimming it, and along it's got a waist there and has what you call a peplum. It hung down over the hips, and that's the skirt that went with it. By World War I, skirts began to go up. That's a dramatic. No, skirts. All shocked. One of the reasons was that women, of course, served, and they wore a uniform, and the uniform that nurses and other women wore during the war. The skirts were shorter because they were active, they were doing things. They needed above-ankle skirts. They couldn't be tripping around, and that helped and influenced fashion. And so the fashion, in general, skirt hems went up, and they kind of stayed up above the ankle. Although some women, of course, still wore longer garments there. But this is just a beautiful, beautiful, beautifully made and beautiful fabric, and I hope to see this also, and I hope you will see it soon on a mannequin here.
And just notice the amazing work we've done on putting things on padded
yes, that's a good point.
hangers, because we want to take care of our collections.
Yes,
here.
because I can tell you from the collections I have seen all over the place, often the worst damage is done from wire coat hangers sticking out through the shoulders and tearing the fabric. And often a garment that was beautiful and it lasted all this time was ruined from being stored badly. So having that padded, hopefully shaped to fit the garment. But in the meantime, I have to say I've been very impressed by the work that everyone has done here in trying to get the storage into a good shape to keep things in as best shape as they can. Okay.
You want to talk about this?
That's just a sexy 1930s dress. The long slim line there, and it's very hip hugging, and it has that little drooping V-neck from a cowl neck. It's sort of cut on the bias for the ladies who are interested, and it has a little weight hanging on the inside that makes it sort of hang in a nice fold. And those little shoulder capes were very fashionable in the 30s. And you'll see that little fox. They were extra fashionable if you could afford one. And so it's there with its little beady eyes and nose hanging over one shoulder there. That's just a very sexy, nice dress to have in the collection.
And shall I add that?
Yeah, why not? Now, the other thing to bear in mind, the difference between those who could afford worth or afford high quality clothes. Some women who could afford those things also could afford luxurious lingerie and underwear. Now, until probably about 1900 or a little before, Victorian underwear was cotton. You've probably all seen cotton petticoats, long pantaloons that women wore under the skirts. That was what underwear was made of, cotton. But and you heard, I have studied the American silk industry. By the late 1890s and into the early 1900s, American silk industry was going full steam ahead, and there was suddenly on the market affordable silk. It wasn't cheap, but it was certainly affordable, where before only the most wealthy could afford silk, and suddenly ordinary women could afford inexpensive silk, so-called for blouses and for other garments. And for the women who had always dressed in silk, they had night dresses like this. That's a silk night dress, or is it negligee night dress, with, again, beautiful lace. That would have been very expensive. It's a luxury garment, And by the 15s, 20s, a new fabric came on the market called rayon that imitated silk. And by that time, every woman could afford silk-like underwear with machine-made lace. And so everybody could wear nice lace and frillies and everything else underneath, made of silk-like fabric. But the wealthy still were able to wear the best chiffon silks and satins for underwear.
Do you mind if I add a little bit about the black dress I was going to say? Some of you know Mrs. Stotesbury, one of the wealthy cottage owners. This was her dress, and we have a little picture of her tonight on the mantle when she was presented to King Charles V. George. Charles, sorry. It's on the brain.
That was in the days when you had debutantes and you would be presented at court, and the kind of dress you wore, then it was prescribed, you were told, you had to, the neckline, the length of the skirt, how frilly, a feather in your hair, all of those things. It was a prescribed dress that you had to wear so that the king's eye wouldn't fall on something that wasn't appropriate.
The children's dress or the shawls?
This actually,
I'll hold it up.
It looks rather a sad little dress here. It's a little girl's dress. It's obviously, I think, missing a little jacket that would have gone with it. But it's, if you can see that at all. And again, it's a silk, it is a silk. And little girls were dressed, and wealthy little girls were dressed just in the same, very similar to their mothers, and with all the frills and furbelows and so on. And this is just a little surviving example, again, of dressmaking and a lot of skill in the making. Okay, yeah. Okay. Now, this was a recent gift to the society, and I'm sure. Tell me, is there anybody here who has not heard of a Paisley Shawl? Paisley? No? Anybody? Well, the thing is, a Paisley Shawl is actually named after a city in Scotland, which made them. But they were imitating something that a had originated in India, particularly in Kashmir, in the Himalayas, using the fine under fur from a special kind of goat in the mountains. And that was made into very fine, thin fabric. This would have been soft and fine at one time, this central area, but it's gone rather hard now.
Jackie wanted us to hold the full thing up
Yes,
so you would see the
suitable.
drama of the beauty of this.
Now, this is from about, I think, maybe 1810 or thereabouts. And it is hand done. All of that pattern is hand done. On the reverse, you can see, if you can't really, maybe afterwards you can come and take a look, but it's all hand done, and they were worked on. Also a lot of embroidery is involved with it too, but this would have been brought to Europe, and the fashion in 1810 or thereabouts was, you may have seen it, women wore very high-waisted dresses that hung down straight. And cotton was the fabric that was fashionable. It was pretty chilly, and suddenly these shawls came on the market, and they were perfect. And there are lots of paintings of wealthy women wearing one of these, draped, around the shoulders and over their arms. Ingres, the French painter, painted lots of portraits showing these patterns. Napoleon's wife was famous. She had dresses made out of these, where she had the dress made of this and these at the bottom going around the hem. So this phenomenon of this kind of design burst on Europe from India at the time of Napoleonic War, when Napoleon went through Egypt and there were other things going on. So it started in, maybe it was a 100-year phenomenon. In the mid-1700s, there were Persian and Kashmir shawls with a very small, naturalistic-looking flower just embroidered across them here and there. And then as time went by, it got a little bit bigger, and then it got a little bit stylized, and it became, because of the weaving technique, it became a little bit sort of a geometric style to it. And then it grew into this shape, which is called a bhuta, which is the word for flower. And then the inside of the bhuta started to get lots of pattern in it. And the pattern just grew and evolved over time, got more and more complicated. And what happened again in Europe, the weavers in Europe began to imitate this. And they developed a machine technique for weaving this kind of pattern. And in fact, it killed the Kashmir weavers. They were out of work. They couldn't keep up with it. And it's a long story, the whole business of the Kashmir shawls. And in fact, they tried to keep up with the machine-made pieces. They took to sharing. In fact, some of this is like that, weaving parts of it, and then they sewed the pieces together. A lot of this, the pieces are sewn. Different weavers wove different sections, and they're sewn together. The seams very cleverly done at the back. But they couldn't keep up, of course, with industrial production, such as Paisley, the town of Paisley produced at low prices. And the fashion for Paisley shawls died out around 1860 for various reasons. One partly, of course, that was the 1860s was when the bustle came in. Remember the bustle of fashion? And you couldn't really drape one of those once you had a bustle. So we're not going to take this one out, I don't think.
Yes, we are. But we just wanted to show how carefully they are normally stored. And you can watch us unveil this one. This one also came in recently. Both of these were from the Bowden family. Yes. So the family that originally built this house. So it's another reason why these are very special.
They're very interesting. This one is very interesting. There's a lot of, it's hand, again, that pattern is all hand woven. And the pieces are stitched together, you can see it on the back. And it's just a marathon of skill.
This is acid-free tissue and acid-free boxes that we recently purchased here at the museum. And we are wearing white gloves so that the acids from our hands don't hurt the fabric. Okay, so we're gonna hold this up. Oh, you wanted that, oh, this is the, sorry. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, and there are seams in this one. You can see them at the back here. It's pieced together. It's actually a patchwork you're looking at, and you can't tell. It's a patchwork. Yeah. And so these are really very important textiles to have in your collection. Not every museum. Lots of them have Paisley machine woven ones. Not many have these beautiful, extraordinary hand woven shawls.
And the date of this one?
I think that these are the early, this is late, this is later. This is maybe 1840, 50 period when they were struggling to keep up with the increasingly machine woven examples that were flooding into the country. And the thing for you also to remember is this is all natural dyeing at that point.
We're gonna put this back nicely, but we'll do that after you all leave.
But to go from one extreme to the other, this is machine-made silk. I think this would date from about the late 1940s, and the skirt would probably have been that long because it's up to here. And that style of jacket, very conventional, and just pre what we call the new look that was first on the scene around the late 1940s, 1950. So it's in beautiful shape. There's nothing wrong with it. The silk is in good shape, no rips or tears. And again, this is a very choice piece to have in your collection, representing that day.
How about the collage?
Oh yes. Now we're jumping through the centuries here.
We're jumping backwards now.
Yeah.
Wow.
This is known as a calash there, and it folds down like a concertina and it opens again. And these hats like this, or bonnets, sort of began in the 18th century, you know, when women were wearing those huge hairstyles, and when they went out, they had to have something that would cover their hair. And this again, we're talking about aristocrats, remember? And however, they lingered in fashion as a sort of outdoor hat or bonnet. And in fact, for those of you who perhaps read the English novelist Mrs. Gaskell, who was contemporary of Dickens, anybody know Mrs. Gaskell's writings? She wrote about England in the 1840s, 50s and thereabout. And she wrote a famous set of short stories called Cranford. I think they televised some of it. And it's wonderful stories about a bunch of little maiden ladies who lived in this village, which is just south of Manchester, a fictional village. And she has a wonderful scene in one of the chapters or the stories of them all going out for the evening to visit a friend, and how when they arrived, they had to get their cloaks off and their calashes off. So these were old ladies still wearing a calash in 1840, as late as that.
And that's one of the oldest pieces in our
Yes.
collection. It's not in perfect condition, but it's not too bad for this sort of thing. But it's one of the things that we hope, if we get donations and grants, we'll be able to do some conservation work on that. So,
Okay.
what else do we have? We have a white vest here, and I can.
Well, I think when I mentioned the chauffeur's vest, I really should mention this white vest. So gentlemen in the summer often wore white linen vests, and so while the gentleman wore the beautifully laundered white linen vest, the chauffeur is down in his everyday, not so exotic, not so sophisticated garment. So, is there anything else? else?
Well, maybe you could take some questions if anyone
Yes,
has
yes, I would
questions.
love to take questions, yes.
What did they make sequins out of 100 years ago?
Yeah. Some of it's made out of mica, you know, as an actual substance, little shiny bits. And plastics, there were forms of plastic quite early in the 19th, by the end of the 19th century. That's really useful, yeah. Yes.
And earlier you said this was Mrs. Stotesbury's dress or
Yes.
nightgown? To be
Dress, this is
That's
the
a
dress.
That's a
Okay.
dress, yeah.
To be delicate,
Well,
what type of foundation garments do some wear when they go
That's,
something like that?
that's a good question, because in the 1930s, fashions were very sinuous, very, you know, you've all seen the 1930s movies with those long, elongated dresses. And there were corsets, long body corsets that you could wear to sort of control all the annoying lumps and bumps that are hard to deal with. You know, so yes, there were. In fact, corsetry was getting more and more wearable because rubber and stretchy fabrics were being made at that time, and that had a big impact on how corsets were manufactured. And so that was a good question. And I just recap, I mentioned earlier that when women used these shawls at the time when they wore those very high-waisted dresses in the early 1800s when that was fashionable. Again, everybody wore that high-waisted style with just the tubular dress. So, I mean, we weren't all young teenagers at the same time. And so what did women do who were a little on the lumpier side? Well, there was a new body garment, you know. Wherever there's a need, fashion will come up with a solution. And it was like a bone, you know, long down to about here, and it often had a busk, you know, straight down. There was a slit down the front. You could slide like a stick, the equivalent of a flat stick that kept you up straight and helped flatten out certain parts. So, yes.
The silk nightgown, I
Yeah.
think, it's kind of a butterscotch
Yes,
color.
yeah.
You said that would have been very expensive at the time.
Yeah.
What is very expensive at the time?
Well, I can't quote you a figure, but you have to say it would be expensive in the sense that the ordinary working person would not even be aware of its existence. It would only be in special shops, you know, that sold very high-end garments, you know, and the sort of one, as they say, if you had to ask how much it cost, it was out of the ordinary pocketbook realm of an average ordinary person, or even most middle-class people at that time. But that changed at the end of that's when it became more popular, when silk became more and more available. It was less expensive. Yes.
The piece that had the lace collar, you said that was a Portland designer.
Yes.
And the sequins, both of them make me wonder about who would have been the people that were hand sewing the sequins on, and was the lace made here in the States? Was that Flemish, or where was the lace coming from?
Well, a lot of lace that looks handmade is machine made. And there were machines making lace as early as like about 1830, I think, even to 1820. There was a Lever's lace machine that made those big there's a lot of black lace shawls turn up in costume collections. But there are some very fine laces. You have a display of some in one of your rooms here. But I don't think many of these wedding dresses had real handmade lace on them. There were some beautiful laces. Often even experts have trouble distinguishing machine, you know, from the handmade lace on some of these cases there. And as far as, you know, the stitching and the sewing, dressmaking was a big profession for a lot of women were seamstresses and dressmakers. If you look in street directories from like 1900 and later, even up to the 1950s, you will find a lot of listings for dressmakers. Because, you know, it wasn't until really, I would say, the 60s that it stopped being snobby. You know, it was everyone preferred to say, oh, I have it made, you know, my dressmaker made it for me, which sounded better, because they kind of were snobby about wearing ready-to-wear, ready-made garments. So dressmakers, depending on their level of skill, there were some who were extremely skilled, such as the ones who could make these wedding dresses. They would be able to advise on fashion and style, also on fabric. Some of them would have fabric on that they could help you, you could purchase. And they would be the top of the labor line. Then further down there would be somebody employed to sew when the long seams. That was by hand at one time, but by the end of 19th century there were machines. The long seams were done by machines. But then there was finishing to be done. There were buttonholes to be stitched. There were buttons to be stitched on, hooks and eyes to be stitched on. And in the inside of the skirts, there was often special lining that had to be made. There was braid around the hem of the skirts because they scuffed along the ground. So there was a lot of detail work. And so a girl might start off as at the minion, you know, at the bottom level and work her way up. Or maybe some women, that's all they did, was the low level work, you know, the long seams and the hard work. That was certainly true, let's say, with men's shirts. Women often would have to make maybe half a dozen shirts in a couple of days in order to earn enough to be a minimum wage, until shirts started to be made by using sewing machines. And so the history of dressmaking and the growth of the ready-to-wear industry is a whole subject in itself, and it's really relatively recent. Do I see a hand over here? Yeah, no? Yeah.
So how did they clean these beautiful dresses
Yes.
back in the day?
Well, they didn't put them in a washing machine.
No.
Well, it depended on the fabric. Remember, outerwear, like when you see the crinoline dresses and any dresses in the 19th century, even some of the 20th century dresses, there were ways you could sponge them, there was dry cleaning, but also remember, women and men wore underwear, that underwear I was talking about, that came between your body and the clothes. And so the underwear got washed. And there are wonderful descriptions in books and historical reports on the problems of wash day, especially in the 19th century, because they boiled all that white cotton underwear. And, you know, they had to boil all that. They had to rub it on boards. They had to squeeze it out by hand. Eventually there were rollers that were invented. Maybe some of you have seen those rollers for drying, you know, squeezing the water out. Then they had to be hung out to dry. What did you do if the weather wasn't good? So washing and getting underwear and everything clean. But so the long and the short of it is to say that people didn't perhaps smell quite as good, clean as we are used to. There was a difference. But you would not wash a silk dress. You know, sometimes dresses, particularly in the days of the crinoline dress or when you know the big skirts, the dress might be unpicked and the fabric reversed, so you get a fresh look to your dress. That wasn't uncommon. And in the days of hand sewing, that wasn't so difficult to undo as if it was a sewing machine, done on a sewing machine. Yes.
I mean, this almost is very similar to a technique of hooking up a rug almost. What would be a typical time to be spent on a fabric this size, the total amount of time to produce it? I mean, this is a tremendous amount of
Oh, a long
labor.
time.
Yeah, of course,
Very
but I mean,
intensive, very intense. It's a woven, it's woven.
That's correct,
Yeah.
it's very
By
simple.
men?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, by men. Yeah, these were woven, these patterns were woven by men.
Sure.
Yeah, men. And it's very difficult to describe how this is done. You know,
Ballpark, if
it's-
any
yeah.
historical
Well-
note has been made to how long would one of these take for a person hour? I'm not saying man
Well,
hour in that sense.
Let
but-
me see, when they, if I can, let me recall for a moment, when they first were having to deal, the Kashmiris were having to deal with the competition from the imports, and they started to perhaps split the weaving between them. That they would all weave, one would weave this bit, and one would weave that, and then they would be gathered. And I did read a statistic once that at one point, 1,300 separate weavers contributed pieces to go into one shawl.
I can imagine
Yeah.
that, that's why I was thinking,
Yeah.
because the hours, this is a
And-
lot more
Oh,
fun.
yeah, and maybe you can come up and look a little closer at how fine it is. Yeah, and, and it's, of course, again, they were using very fine yarn, you know, and the thing is that, it's what you call it, it's a tapestry weave. Tapestry is a weave where you can weave shapes like this, and in Europe, it was a tapestry weave, but it was a flat weave. This is a twill, what you call a twill tapestry.
Right.
You'll see this, the diagonal line. Do you see that?
Sure.
It's a twill
Sure.
there. And this is an unusual piece. I don't very often get to see one quite like that.
That's what I was
Yeah,
saying, but
yeah.
also the color, if you look at it from one end
Yeah.
to the other end, is pretty stable.
Yeah.
And usually to find the source of the coloring, which mostly are plants, and
Yeah.
to be able to dye the entire yarn in that same color so that the entire piece comes in one harmony is
Yeah.
rare. So that's a very impressive
Yeah.
piece.
Well, remember the Indians were very skilled,
Of course.
Kashmiris were very skilled weavers and dyers. And this is sort of redder. In fact, the earlier Paisley, or the Kashmiri, had more bluing, which would be indigo. But with this, it would be, it could be kermes or it could be madder, what we call madder, which madder is like a root, and they extract red dye from it. And it was grown as a crop. Even in Europe, that was a big crop until chemical madder or alizarin was invented about 1860 or thereabouts. And that when chemical dye came in, particularly alizarin red, it killed the whole sector of the agricultural business because a lot of farmers relied on their crop of madder, the root crop, and all over Europe and also in America here. Suddenly that wasn't wanted anymore. You know? But and the greens were overdyed. There isn't very much green in that at all here. And
The one that we have upstairs has more blue in it,
Yes,
and it's a
yes.
very early one.
Yeah,
This
yes.
is in Mrs. Bowden's bedroom,
Yeah.
so
yeah, we
take a
sort
look
of
at.
we sort of draped it. It's hard to really drape them the way that they were worn. I should mention, perhaps going back, originally, lengths of fabric were given by aristocrats to each other as gifts, or if you had a visiting potentate, you would give lengths of the best fabric that was woven or produced in your country. And then also, if you were rewarding or paying your household staff, you would do it with lengths of cloth. And of course, the best expensive cloth went to the most elite ranks in your employ and down the scale. So that whole idea of lengths of cloth as currency. People today, cloth is just there. Nobody thinks about it. But it was very valuable, and it was a high intensity labor to produce on every level. So anyway, so these lengths of cloth, to have extra cloth to drape on yourself, particularly men, was a sign of status and wealth. And so these lengths of Kashmiri fabric were worn by Persian and then Kashmiri men, just like over the shoulder in the early, let's say 1700s. And remember, Persian influence was strong because it was the Mughals who came down from Persia into India, so that the sort of culture was related. Anyway, so they wore it over there. Then they began to wear it like tied around the waist and hanging down with the pattern along the bottom. And then from there, things just began to change. Then the Europeans sort of began to take these things that were, tied around and to Europe. And then women cottoned onto them. and began to wear them as part of fashion. And it was very timely because they were wearing these flimsy, high-waisted, thin dresses. And so these shawls suddenly coming from the India were perfect accessory. And so it was just one of those historical cycles that happened. And then, of course, they started making them by machine, and then it went out of fashion. So I know this is a very potted history, but hard to explain a complicated situation. But I think the thing, maybe, if anything, I always say I'm a textile junkie. I'm always trying to convert people because, you know, there was a time, I think, when there were still mills around, people respected fabric and what it took to manufacture it. But today, nobody knows. It's a mystified thing. You know, cloth just sort of appears. Nobody thinks, you know, how it got there or what it's made of. You know, whether we should have closets jammed full of all that fabric that we don't really need. Where in the past people saved every little bit of cloth and used it for something or other. I mean, any garment that one had was worn or passed down or sold second-hand and bought second-hand, worked its way down, might end up as a floor cloth. But every scrap of fabric in another world was used, whereas today it goes to the dump. It's really terrible. And so, yes.
Oh, sorry. In your opinion, when did the fashion industry start inadvertently promoting anorexia based on the way fashion is evolved?
Yeah. Well, I think I don't know if it was a distinct date, but I think it was with the advent of the big fashion magazines, you know, Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, and the big couturiers and the catwalks in Paris, where those extreme fashions just looked as if they were on a coat hanger. It was easier. You didn't have to fit in the same way. Like in the days of Worth, when Worth, the great French designer, he measured all his, he had like all the statistics of his customers. They were all shapes and sizes. But I think the anorexia and everything came with the production of high fashion, you know, and everybody wanting to look like that. And it's a very sad thing. I think there's a reaction now. I've noticed in several mail order catalogs, they have larger sizes of models now. In fact, I was in LL Bean's last week. They have some outsized mannequins now in the store with the clothes in the larger sizes. And that was first time I've seen that. And there's another couple of catalogs I get in Leeds. I get snowed down with them. It would not be all. And I am seeing a larger model being featured along with all the other, although none of them is quite that skinny now, unless you look in Vogue. I think Vogue should be banned because the extreme photographs, so-called fashion in there are just unbelievable.
Jackie, I know there are more questions out there, and I invite people to come up and speak with our speaker individually, but I want to thank you for your presentation. If you would like to come up and get a closer look at some of these things, please don't touch, just look. Please don't bring any more refreshments in here, but please, I think are there some leftovers out there? I'm not sure. One thing I'll call your attention to, and again, please don't touch, we brought it out just special for tonight. It hasn't been out as far as I know. This is the flag from the Crown Princess Cecily. And some of you know the story of the German ocean liner that had to turn around and shelter here in Bar Harbor. So take a look at the flag of the Crown Princess Cecily. And thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you.
And I started getting them up, right? So 5.